Hey guys! Tonight we begin with the brutal reality of one of history's most romanticized conflicts, the Crusades. Those holy wars that Hollywood painted as noble quests filled with shining knights and righteous glory. But forget everything you think you know about chivalry and honor. The truth is, if you were dropped into the middle of a Crusader army marching toward Jerusalem, you probably wouldn't survive your first day. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's 1096. And Pope Urban II has just delivered the most persuasive sales pitch in medieval history. Take up the cross, he declared, march to the Holy Land, and God will forgive all your sins. Sounds like a pretty good deal, right? Wrong. Because what the Pope didn't mention in his rousing speech was the staggering reality of what you'd actually face on a crusade. We're talking about a journey that would make modern military deployments look like luxury vacations. First, let's be clear about what kind of person became a crusader. You weren't signing up for some weekend warrior fantasy camp. Most crusaders were desperate, younger sons with no inheritance, criminals fleeing justice, farmers escaping famine, or merchants whose businesses had collapsed. Sure, there were some genuine believers and a handful of actual knights, but the majority were people who had nothing left to lose, and that should tell you something right there. The moment you took the cross, your old life was over. You sold everything you owned, said goodbye to your family knowing you'd probably never see them again, and joined what was essentially a massive, poorly organized mob heading east. No GPS, no supply chains, no medical support. Just you, whatever you could carry, and the vague promise that God would provide. Let's start with the journey itself, because most people never even made it to the Holy Land. The First Crusade began in 1096, and it took most armies nearly 3 years to reach Jerusalem. 3 years of walking across Europe and Asia Minor through hostile territory, in all kinds of weather, carrying everything you needed to survive. Modern hikers struggle with a weekend camping trip, and you're talking about a transcontinental death march that lasted longer than most college degrees. The logistics were a nightmare. There were no McDonald's along the route, no holiday inns, no convenience stores. You ate what you could find, forage, steal, or buy from locals who probably wanted to kill you anyway. Water was scarce and often contaminated. Disease spread through the ranks like wildfire. Dysentery, typhus, and plague were constant companions. Medieval medicine consisted of prayer, bloodletting, and hoping for the best. And that was just the beginning. Because once you actually reached the Levant, the real nightmare started. You weren't fighting some Hollywood version of warfare with noble duels and dramatic sword fights. This was brutal, grinding siege warfare in a climate that European bodies weren't designed to handle. The heat alone would drop grown men in full armor. Dehydration killed more crusaders than enemy swords ever did. But let's back up and talk about what you'd actually be wearing and carrying, because medieval warfare wasn't exactly user-friendly. If you were lucky enough to afford armor, you'd be wrapped in heavy mail that weighed about as much as a small person. In the desert heat of the Middle East, that armor became a portable oven. Crusaders literally cooked inside their own protective gear. Many died of heat stroke before they ever saw combat. Your weapons were basic and brutal. A sword if you were wealthy, more likely a spear, axe or club if you weren't. No fancy engineering here, just sharp metal designed to hack through human flesh and bone. And you'd better know how to use them because there were no training montages, no wise mentors to teach you proper technique. You learned by fighting, and if you learned slowly, you died quickly. The The Crusader armies weren't exactly models of military efficiency either. Command structures were chaotic at best. Multiple leaders from different countries, speaking different languages, with competing agendas and massive egos. French nobles despised German princes who looked down on Italian merchants who couldn't stand English knights. Unity was a fantasy, and coordination was nearly impossible. Supply lines were non-existent. Unlike modern armies with their complex logistics networks, Crusader forces had to live off the land. That meant constant foraging, raiding, and pillaging just to survive another day. Local populations quickly learned to hide their food, poison their wells, and disappear into the countryside whenever a Crusader army approached. You weren't liberating anybody. You were a locust swarm in armour. The enemy you'd be facing weren't the cartoon villains of medieval propaganda either. Muslim armies were often better organised, better equipped, and fighting on their home turf. They knew the terrain, the climate, and the tactics that worked in desert warfare. Many had been fighting each other for generations, and were hardened veterans by the time European amateurs showed up. Saladin, the famous Kurdish general who recaptured Jerusalem, wasn't some barbaric warlord. He was a sophisticated military strategist who ran circles around Crusader armies. His forces used mounted archers, superior siege engines, and coordinated cavalry charges that crushed European heavy infantry. The idea that Christian faith would somehow overcome superior tactics and local knowledge was a delusion that got thousands of Crusaders killed. And let's talk about siege warfare, because that's where most of the actual fighting happened. Medieval battles weren't glorious field engagements with charging knights and flying banners. They were long, grinding sieges of fortified cities that could last months or even years. Imagine being stuck outside the walls of Antioch or Jerusalem for 8 months, slowly starving, watching your friends die of disease, while defenders dropped stones, boiling oil, and worse things on your head. The psychological toll was devastating. You're thousands of miles from home, surrounded by people who want to kill you, watching your companions die horrible deaths from wounds that would be minor inconveniences today. Medieval medicine couldn't handle infected cuts, broken bones, or battlefield trauma. A simple sword wound to the leg could mean amputation with a rusty saw and no anesthesia, assuming you were lucky enough to find someone willing to do it. Sleep was a luxury you couldn't afford. Constant threat of night raids, the need to maintain watch schedules, and the simple discomfort of sleeping on rocky ground in metal clothing meant chronic exhaustion. Add malnutrition, dehydration, and the stress of knowing that tomorrow might be your last day alive, and you've got a recipe for complete mental breakdown. The religious motivation that got you into this mess would start wearing thin pretty quickly. It's easy to believe in divine providence when you're sitting in a comfortable church listening to inspiring sermons. It's a lot harder when you're watching your best friend die of gangrene while Muslim cavalry picks off your supply trains. Many Crusaders abandoned their vows and tried to make it home, though desertion often meant death if you were caught. Even if you somehow survived the journey and made it to a successful siege, the aftermath was often worse than the battle itself. Medieval armies had no concept of modern rules of war or civilian protection. When a city fell, everything inside was considered fair game. The sack of Jerusalem in 1099 was a bloodbath that shocked even contemporary observers. Crusaders slaughtered men, women, and children indiscriminately, burned synagogues and mosques, and looted everything of value. And here's the thing that really drives home how unprepared you'd be. Most Crusaders had never seen a city larger than their home village before leaving Europe. Jerusalem, Damascus, and Cairo were massive urban centres with sophisticated infrastructure, advanced architecture, and complex societies. The culture shock alone would be overwhelming, even before you factored in the language barriers, different foods, and completely alien customs. The climate was another killer that medieval Europeans weren't prepared for. The scorching heat of summer, the unexpected cold of winter nights in the desert, sandstorms that could blind you, and diseases that didn't exist back home. Your body, adapted to the cool, wet climate of northern Europe, would rebel against every aspect of Middle Eastern weather. Water discipline was crucial, and almost nobody understood it. European armies were used to abundant rivers and streams. In the desert, water sources were precious, often controlled by the enemy, and contaminated with all sorts of nasty things. Crusaders died of thirst within sight of the Mediterranean Sea because they didn't know how to find or purify water sources. The economic reality was brutal too. This wasn't some government-funded military operation with regular paychecks and supply drops. You financed your own crusade, and when your money ran out, which it inevitably did, you were on your own. Many crusaders sold themselves into slavery just to survive. Others turned to banditry, robbing pilgrims and merchants. The noble, holy war quickly devolved into a criminal free-for-all. Navigation was primitive at best. No accurate maps, no compasses, no GPS coordinates. You followed rough directions, landmarks that might or might not exist anymore, and the word of local guides who might be leading you into an ambush. Getting lost wasn't just inconvenient, it was a death sentence. Entire armies wandered in circles for weeks, slowly starving in hostile territory. The communication problems were staggering. Latin was the language of the church, but most crusaders spoke only their local dialects. French knights couldn't understand German peasants who couldn't communicate with Italian merchants. Orders got lost in translation, strategies fell apart due to language barriers, and coordination was nearly impossible. Modern militaries spend years developing communication protocols. Crusader armies just hoped for the best and prayed a lot. And if you think the journey was bad, wait until you experienced medieval combat medicine. There were no medics running around with first aid kits and morphine. When you got wounded, and you would get wounded, your treatment options were limited to whatever the local barber surgeon could improvise with rusty tools and zero understanding of infection. A sword cut to your arm meant someone would pour wine on it, maybe say a prayer, and wrap it in whatever cloth was available. That cloth had probably been used to wipe down weapons, clean armour, or worse. Gangrene set in fast, and once it did, amputation was your only hope. Picture having your leg sawed off with a dull blade while you bit down on a leather strap, fully conscious, listening to your own bones crack. Broken bones were essentially death sentences unless you were incredibly wealthy. No x-rays, no proper splints, no understanding of how bones actually healed. They'd tie some sticks to your leg and hope it grew back straight. Most of the time it didn't, leaving you permanently crippled in an era when mobility meant survival. A limp in the desert was as good as a target painted on your back. The daily routine of a crusader would grind you down faster than any enemy army. You'd wake before dawn, assuming you slept at all, to the sound of horns and shouting sergeants. No coffee, no hearty breakfast, just whatever scraps you'd managed to save from the previous day. Stale bread, rancid meat, and water that tasted like it came from a swamp. Then came the march. Hour after hour of walking in formation, weighed down by armour that never fit quite right, weapons that grew heavier with each step, and a pack full of supplies that seemed to multiply in weight as the day wore on. Your feet would blister inside poorly made boots. Those blisters would pop and become infected, and you'd keep walking because stopping meant getting left behind to die. The hierarchy in Crusader armies was brutal and unforgiving. If you were a peasant, which most Crusaders were, you were barely considered human by the nobles leading the expedition. Knights treated foot soldiers like disposable equipment. When food was scarce, the nobles ate first. When water was limited, common soldiers went thirsty. When it came time to assault a city wall, guess who got volunteered for the suicide missions? Speaking of city walls, siege warfare was where the real nightmare began. Medieval sieges weren't quick affairs with dramatic battles and clear victories. They were grinding wars of attrition that could last months. You'd spend weeks digging trenches, building siege engines, and trying to starve out defenders who were probably better supplied than you were. The siege engines themselves were death traps. Catapults and trebuchets required dozens of men to operate, and they had a nasty habit of malfunctioning at the worst possible moments. The ropes would snap under tension, sending wooden beams flying into your own ranks. The counterweights would shift, crushing operators underneath. And all the while, defenders on the walls were shooting arrows, dropping stones, and pouring boiling oil on anyone who got too close. Scaling ladders were essentially wooden suicide devices. You'd climb up a flimsy ladder while people above you tried to push it away from the wall, drop rocks on your head, or set the whole thing on fire. Even if you made it to the top, you'd be facing fresh defenders in a confined space with nowhere to retreat. Most ladder assaults failed spectacularly, leaving piles of broken bodies at the base of enemy walls. The psychological warfare was just as devastating as the physical combat. Muslim armies were masters of intimidation. They'd display the severed heads of captured crusaders on spear points, play drums and horns all night to prevent Christian forces from sleeping, and launch diseased corpses over city walls to spread plague and terror. Your own leaders weren't much better. Crusader nobles were notorious for their cruelty toward their own men. Desertion was punished by hanging or mutilation. Cowardice in battle meant public humiliation and exile, which was effectively a death sentence in hostile territory. Even minor infractions could result in brutal beatings or having your rations cut. The religious fanaticism that motivated many crusaders quickly turned toxic under pressure. When things went badly, which they usually did, someone had to be blamed. Jews, Eastern Christians, and anyone else who didn't fit the narrow definition of acceptable faith became targets. Crusader armies slaughtered entire communities of people they were supposedly there to protect. Food poisoning was a constant threat that could drop you faster than any enemy weapon. With no refrigeration and minimal understanding of food safety, everything you ate was potentially lethal. Meat spoiled quickly in the heat, water sources were contaminated with human waste, and local foods could trigger allergic reactions or worse in European digestive systems not adapted to Middle Eastern cuisine. The insects alone would drive you insane. Flies, mosquitoes, fleas, lice, and dozens of other biting creatures that didn't exist in Northern Europe. They carried diseases, infected wounds, and made sleep nearly impossible. You'd scratch yourself raw trying to get relief, creating new wounds that would become infected in the unsanitary conditions of army camps. Personal hygiene was non-existent. You'd go weeks without bathing, wearing the same clothes until they literally rotted off your body. Your hair would become matted with blood, dirt, and grease. Your teeth would fall out from malnutrition and poor diet. The smell of a crusader army could be detected from miles away, a mixture of unwashed bodies, rotting food, and human waste. The weather extremes would break you mentally and physically. Desert heat that could kill you in hours, followed by nights so cold you'd wake up covered in frost. Sandstorms that stripped skin from exposed flesh and made breathing nearly impossible. Flash floods that washed away entire camps and drowned men in their sleep. Even basic tasks became monumental challenges, starting a fire with flint and steel when everything was wet or sandy, finding clean water when every source was either controlled by enemies or contaminated with corpses, repairing damaged equipment with no proper tools or replacement parts. The constant threat of ambush meant you never truly relaxed. Muslim forces were experts at hit-and-run tactics, striking supply trains and isolated groups before melting back into the landscape. You'd march for days, seeing nothing but empty desert. Then suddenly arrows would rain down from hidden positions and half your unit would be dead before you even knew you were under attack. Your equipment would fail at the worst possible moments. Sword blades would snap in combat, leaving you holding a useless hilt. Armour straps would break, leaving vital areas exposed. Bowstrings would snap from heat and humidity, turning your ranged weapon into an expensive club. The economic desperation that drove many crusaders quickly turned into criminal behaviour. Armies would pillage Christian villages, rob pilgrims, and demand tribute from terrified locals just to survive another week. The noble religious mission devolved into organized banditry with a theological justification. Disease spread through crusader camps like wildfire in dry grass. Dysentery would hollow out entire units, leaving men too weak to fight or march. Malaria, typhus, and plague turned mighty armies into collections of sick, dying, desperate men who could barely hold their weapons. Medieval medical understanding was so primitive that doctors often made diseases worse with their treatments. The isolation was crushing. No letters from home, no news from family, no idea if your village even still existed. You were completely cut off from everything familiar, surrounded by alien landscapes, hostile populations, and the constant possibility of violent death. Many crusaders simply went insane from the psychological pressure, and through all of this horror, you'd still have to maintain the pretense of holy war, attend mass, pray regularly, follow religious strictures, and pretend that God was on your side while everything around you suggested otherwise. The cognitive dissonance between religious rhetoric and brutal reality broke many men's faith entirely. The simple act of staying alive required constant vigilance and luck that most people didn't have. In a world without modern medicine, communication, navigation, or logistics, every day was a roll of the dice with death, and the house always wins eventually. The social dynamics within Crusader armies were toxic beyond imagination. Picture being trapped with thousands of violent, desperate men from different countries who couldn't understand each other and were competing for the same scarce resources. French knights looked down on German peasants who despised Italian merchants who couldn't stand English bowmen. Regional prejudices that simmered back home exploded into open violence when hunger and fear took over. Leadership disputes turned deadly regularly. When multiple nobles claimed command of the same forces, the result wasn't negotiation or compromise. It was armed conflict within your own army, while enemies watched and waited for the perfect moment to strike. Men died fighting their own allies over questions of precedence and pride, while the real enemy picked off stragglers and cut supply lines. The language barriers weren't just inconvenient, they were lethal. Battle orders got lost in translation, retreat signals were misunderstood, and coordinated attacks fell apart because nobody could communicate effectively under pressure. Imagine trying to execute a complex military maneuver when half your army speaks Norman French, a quarter speaks various German dialects, and the rest communicate in Italian, English, or Flemish. Chaos doesn't begin to describe it. Currency problems added another layer of misery to your existence. Different regions used different coins with varying silver content and exchange rates that fluctuated based on local politics and military success. What passed for money in France might be worthless in Constantinople and completely unknown in Jerusalem. Many crusaders arrived in the Holy Land broke, having been cheated by money changers or robbed by fellow Christians along the way. The religious politics were just as complicated as the military ones. Eastern Orthodox Christians, who you were supposedly there to help, viewed Western Catholics with deep suspicion and often outright hostility. They'd been fighting their own religious and political battles for centuries, and suddenly having thousands of armed Western Europeans march through their territory wasn't exactly welcome news. Local Christian populations often sided with Muslim rulers against Crusader armies, not out of religious conviction, but because they knew who would still be there after the Crusaders died or went home. Why risk everything to help temporary invaders who might massacre you tomorrow over some theological disagreement you didn't understand? The Crusader states that were eventually established were military colonies surrounded by hostile populations and dependent on constant reinforcement from Europe. If you survived the initial conquest and decided to stay, you'd be living in a fortress mentality for the rest of your life. Never more than a few miles from people who wanted to kill you and reclaim their land. The climate wreaked havoc on European bodies in ways that went far beyond simple heat exhaustion. Your skin would crack and bleed from the dry air. Your lips would split open and refuse to heal. The sun would burn you through your armor, leaving permanent scars and increasing your risk of deadly skin infections. Many crusaders went blind from the intense desert glare reflecting off sand and stone. Respiratory problems were epidemic. The combination of desert dust, smoke from fires, and various airborne diseases created a perfect storm of breathing difficulties. Men who'd been strong and healthy in Europe found themselves gasping for air after minimal exertion. Some developed chronic coughs that produced blood and never went away. The food situation was a nightmare that got worse the deeper you penetrated into hostile territory. European crops didn't grow in Middle Eastern soil and climate. Local foods were prepared with spices and cooking methods that could trigger violent digestive reactions in unprepared stomachs. Meat was often the only protein available, but it spoiled quickly and carried diseases that European immune systems had never encountered. Water discipline separated the living from the dead, but nobody taught European peasants how to survive in a desert. You'd see a stream and drink deeply, not realizing it was contaminated with human waste from an upstream village. Or you'd ration your water too carefully and die of dehydration while carrying a full water skin because you were afraid of running out. The psychological impact of constant death was devastating. You'd wake up next to someone, march with them all day, share your meagre rations with them, and find them dead from dysentery by morning. After months of this, many crusaders simply stopped forming attachments to their fellow soldiers. The emotional numbness that followed was its own kind of death. Sleep deprivation was used as a weapon by Muslim commanders who understood European weaknesses better than Europeans understood themselves. Night raids, false alarms, and psychological harassment meant that Crusader armies rarely got more than a few hours of uninterrupted rest. Exhausted men make poor decisions, fight badly, and die easily. The armour that was supposed to protect you often became a death trap. Male hauberks would heat up in the sun until they literally branded your flesh. Helmets became ovens that cooked your brain. The weight distribution of medieval armour wasn't designed for desert warfare, leading to joint damage, muscle tears, and spinal injuries that left men permanently crippled. Weapon maintenance was nearly impossible under campaign conditions. Swords were dull from cutting through sand-filled cloth and couldn't be properly sharpened without a proper forge and quality steel. Crossbow prods would crack in the heat, leaving you with an expensive club. Arrows would warp and fly wide, wasting precious ammunition you couldn't replace. The logistics of moving large armies through hostile territory were beyond the capabilities of medieval technology and organisation. Baggage trains stretched for miles, moved at the pace of the slowest ox cart, and attracted raiders like honey-draw's flies. Protecting your supplies meant spreading your forces thin, but concentrating your forces meant abandoning the supplies you needed to survive. Forage parties became suicide missions as local populations learned to hide their food and livestock. You'd send out men to find grain and cattle, and they'd return empty-handed if they returned at all. Those who came back often brought diseases, wounds, and horror stories that further demoralized the main army. The seasonal campaign cycle was dictated by weather patterns that European commanders didn't understand. Marching during the hot months meant death from heat stroke. Marching during the rainy season meant getting bogged down in mud and flooding. The narrow windows of suitable campaign weather gave enemy forces plenty of time to prepare defences and gather intelligence. Intelligence gathering was primitive and unreliable. You'd march toward a city based on information that was weeks old, only to find it had been reinforced, abandoned, or was never there in the first place. Maps were inaccurate when they existed at all, leading armies into dead ends, impassable terrain, and carefully prepared ambushes. The medical backwards that many understanding of wound treatment was so injuries were made worse by attempted treatment. Battlefield surgeons would pack wounds with whatever material was handy, often introducing deadly infections. Amputations were performed with carpenter's tools, usually resulting in death from blood loss or gangrene within days. Pain management consisted of alcohol, opium if you were incredibly lucky, and biting down on leather straps while someone did horrible things to your body. Most wounded men died not from their original injuries, but from the shock and trauma of medieval medical treatment. The concept of military discipline varied wildly between different contingents of the same army. French knights operated under completely different rules than German infantry, who had nothing in common with Italian crossbowmen. When crisis hit, these differences exploded into open conflict that could shatter an army faster than any enemy action. Desertion was epidemic, but nearly impossible to survive. Leave the army and you'd be alone in hostile territory with no supplies, no local contacts, and no way to get home. Most deserters were found dead within days, killed by exposure, local inhabitants, or wild animals that viewed lone humans as easy prey. The economic incentives that motivated many crusaders disappeared as soon as they realized there was no easy wealth to be gained. Looting required successful battles, and successful battles required surviving long enough to fight them. The promise of rich eastern cities full of gold and spices proved to be propaganda that bore little resemblance to reality. Religious doubt crept in as prayers went unanswered and comrades died horrible deaths despite their faith. Many crusaders began to question whether God really supported their mission, especially when Muslim armies seemed better organized, better equipped, and more successful in battle. The theological crisis that followed broke many men spiritually. The return journey, if you survived long enough to attempt one, was just as dangerous as the original march east. You'd be travelling through territory that now knew exactly what crusader armies were capable of, with local populations that had every reason to seek revenge. Many crusaders who survived years of warfare died on the road home, killed by people they'd brutalized on the way out. Even those who made it back to Europe found that home had changed in their absence. Families had given them up for dead and remarried. Property had been sold to finance the crusade. The communities they'd left no longer had room for traumatized veterans who'd seen and done unspeakable things in the name of God. The physical toll of crusading left permanent marks on survivors. Joint damage from carrying heavy armor across thousands of miles, respiratory problems from breathing desert dust and siege smoke, digestive issues from years of poor diet and contaminated water, and psychological trauma that had no name or treatment in medieval society. The technological gap between European and Middle Eastern military engineering became apparent as soon as Crusader armies encountered their first real fortifications. Muslim siege engines were more advanced, their defensive architecture more sophisticated, and their understanding of logistics far superior to anything Europeans could field. Your daily routine would become a grinding cycle of misery that broke men's spirits before their bodies gave out. Wake before dawn to the sound of horns and shouting. Force down whatever food you could find. March for hours in armor that never fit properly. Fight or prepare to fight. Try to find shelter and food. Attempt to sleep while listening for sounds of approaching enemies. Repeat until you died or went insane, whichever came first. The simple act of staying clean became impossible under campaign conditions. You'd go months without changing clothes, bathing, or even washing your hands. The smell of a crusader army could be detected from miles away, making surprise attacks nearly impossible and attracting scavengers, both human and animal, that followed armies like vultures. The mental strain of watching your companions slowly transform from human beings into desperate animals was perhaps worse than any physical hardship. Men who'd been decent farmers or craftsmen back home became brutal scavengers willing to kill for a handful of grain. The veneer of Christian brotherhood dissolved under the pressure of survival, revealing the savage desperation beneath. You'd witness atrocities that would haunt you for the rest of your life, assuming you lived that long. Crusader armies weren't bound by modern concepts of civilian protection or rules of war. When hunger drove men mad, nothing was off limits. Churches were looted, women and children were enslaved, and entire communities were wiped out for the crime of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The propaganda that had inspired your journey bore no resemblance to the reality on the ground. Those inspiring sermons about liberating the Holy Land from infidel occupation conveniently left out the part where you'd be competing with other Christian armies for the same objectives. French and German crusaders fought pitched battles against each other, while Muslim forces watched from nearby hills, waiting to attack the winners. Cannibalism wasn't uncommon during prolonged sieges or desertings, when cross-supply lines collapsed entirely. The siege of Ma'ara in 1098 saw Crusader forces literally eating the bodies of Muslim defenders when their food ran out. Contemporary chroniclers recorded these events matter-of-factly, as if consuming human flesh was just another tactical decision in the Holy War. Your equipment would deteriorate faster than you could repair or replace it. Leather would crack in the heat. Metal would rust from humidity and blood. Fabric would rot from sweat and filth. A sword that had taken months of a blacksmith's wages to purchase would become a useless piece of corroded iron within weeks of actual use. The constant threat of betrayal made paranoia a survival skill. Local guides would lead armies into carefully prepared ambushes. Merchants would sell poisoned food to desperate soldiers. Even fellow crusaders might slit your throat in your sleep for whatever coins you had hidden in your belongings. Disease moved through crusader camps with the efficiency of a modern biological weapon. Cholera would kill dozens overnight. Plague would decimate entire units before moving on to the next group of victims. Smallpox would leave survivors permanently disfigured and partially blind. There were no vaccines, no antibiotics, no understanding of how diseases spread or how to prevent them. The siege engines that looked so impressive from a distance were death traps up close. Catapults would malfunction and crush their own operators. Trebuchets would throw stones backward into friendly forces. Battering rams would splinter under enemy fire, sending wooden shards into the faces of the men operating them. Medieval engineering was impressive for its time, but it was still primitive and unreliable. Communication breakdowns led to friendly fire incidents that killed more crusaders than enemy action. In the chaos of battle, with poor visibility and no standardized uniforms or signals, it was impossible to tell friend from foe. Men would hack each other to pieces while screaming battle cries in languages nobody else understood. The political situation in the Holy Land was far more complex than European understanding suggested. Muslim rulers fought each other as often as they fought Christians. Local populations included dozens of different ethnic and religious groups with their own agendas and grievances. Trying to navigate these relationships while maintaining military objectives was beyond the capabilities of most Crusader leadership. Your social status back home meant nothing in the face of Middle Eastern warfare. Knights who'd been lords of their own manors found themselves taking orders from whoever happened to be alive and in charge at the moment. Peasants who'd never held weapons more dangerous than farming tools were expected to assault fortified positions defended by professional soldiers. The concept of military intelligence was virtually non-existent. Crusader armies would march blindly into territory controlled by enemies who knew their every movement. Spies were everywhere, feeding information to Muslim commanders who could plan ambushes and defensive strategies with perfect knowledge of Christian capabilities and intentions. Weather became an active enemy that killed more efficiently than any human opponent. Sandstorms would bury entire units alive. Flash floods would wash away camps and drown men in their sleep. The sun would literally cook soldiers inside their armor, leaving mummified corpses that other crusaders would strip for equipment. The promise of spiritual rewards for crusading began to ring hollow when faced with the reality of what holy war actually required: massacring civilians, enslaving children, burning religious sites, and committing every sin imaginable in the name of Christ, created a psychological crisis that destroyed many men's faith entirely. Logistics failures meant that armies would arrive at their destinations without the equipment needed to achieve their objectives. Siege trains would be lost to raiders. Supply ships would sink in storms. Critical specialists like engineers and surgeons would die of disease before their skills were needed, leaving armies unable to function effectively. The cultural shock of encountering advanced Middle Eastern civilization was overwhelming for Europeans who'd grown up in primitive rural communities. Cities like Damascus and Baghdad had running water, advanced medicine, sophisticated architecture, and levels of literacy that wouldn't be seen in Europe for centuries. Your personal hygiene would become a health hazard that attracted insects, spread disease, and made wounds more likely to become infected. Without soap, clean water, or understanding of basic sanitation, Crusader armies became breeding grounds for every pathogen imaginable. The economic exploitation by everyone involved in the crusading movement was staggering. Ship captains charged exorbitant rates for passage to the Holy Land. Local rulers demanded tribute for safe passage through their territories. Merchants sold spoiled food at premium prices to desperate soldiers who had no other options. Military tactics that worked in European warfare were suicidal in Middle Eastern conditions. Heavy cavalry charges were useless in desert terrain. Infantry formations designed for temperate climates collapsed in extreme heat. Siege techniques developed for European fortifications failed against superior Middle Eastern defensive architecture. The return rate for crusaders was appallingly low, not just from death in battle, but from disease, exposure, starvation, and simple exhaustion. Entire armies would leave Europe with tens of thousands of men and return with hundreds of survivors, if anyone returned at all. Your mental health would deteriorate as rapidly as your physical condition. Constant stress, sleep deprivation, malnutrition, and trauma would break down your psychological defenses. Many crusaders developed what we'd now recognize as severe PTSD, but medieval society had no concept of mental illness or trauma treatment. The religious justifications for atrocities became increasingly elaborate as the reality of crusading diverged from Christian teachings. Theologians would invent new doctrines to explain why massacring infants was actually serving God's will, creating a twisted logic that allowed men to commit genocide while believing they were earning salvation. Navigation errors led to armies wandering in circles for weeks, slowly dying of thirst while their enemies watched from a safe distance. Without accurate maps or understanding of local geography, European commanders would march their forces directly into deserts, mountains, or swamps where entire armies would simply disappear. The medical understanding of the time meant that treatable injuries became death sentences. A broken leg that could be easily fixed today would leave you crippled for life, assuming you survived the primitive surgical attempts. Infections that modern antibiotics could cure in days would kill you slowly and painfully over weeks. Supply shortages created a hierarchy of suffering where rank determined who lived and who died. Nobles would eat while common soldiers starved. Knights would have their wounds treated while peasants were left to die. The Christian brotherhood that supposedly motivated the Crusades evaporated the moment resources became scarce. The technological advantages that European armies thought they possessed proved to be largely imaginary. Muslim metallurgy produced superior weapons and armour. Eastern siege engines were more effective than Western designs. Local knowledge of terrain and climate trumped European military traditions every time. Your daily caloric intake would drop to starvation levels within weeks of beginning active campaigning. Medieval armies had no understanding of proper nutrition, and the foods available in the Middle East were often unfamiliar and difficult for European digestive systems to process effectively. The psychological impact of seeing familiar religious symbols in foreign contexts was profoundly disorienting. Visiting the actual sites where Christ had lived and died, only to find them controlled by people you'd been taught to view as enemies, created a cognitive dissonance that shattered many crusaders' worldview. Enemy intelligence networks were far superior to anything Europeans could field. Muslim commanders knew Crusader plans almost as soon as they were made, while Christian armies marched blind into carefully prepared traps and ambushes that decimated their forces before they even attacked. The seasonal knew they were under limitations of medieval warfare meant that armies achieved their objectives. Miss had narrow windows of opportunity to those windows, and you'd be trapped in hostile territory during the worst possible weather conditions, watching your forces melt away from attrition and disease. Your equipment would become a burden rather than protection as conditions deteriorated. Armor would rust and seize up, making movement impossible. Weapons would become too heavy to lift effectively. The tools that were supposed to keep you alive would become instruments of torture that you couldn't remove or repair. The economic incentives that had originally motivated many crusaders disappeared as soon as they realized that successful looting required successful battles, and successful battles required surviving long enough to fight them. The wealth of the East remained tantalizingly out of reach, while men died for lack of basic necessities. Religious ceremonies became hollow rituals performed by men who'd lost all faith in their cause, but were too afraid to admit it. Mass would be celebrated over the bodies of massacred civilians, while priests struggled to reconcile Christian doctrine with the reality of what they'd witnessed and participated in. The simple act of moving an army across hostile territory required skills and knowledge that European commanders simply didn't possess. Desert navigation, water location, climate adaptation, and cultural sensitivity were all alien concepts to men trained in European warfare. Your social relationships would deteriorate as quickly as your physical condition. Trust became impossible when anyone might kill you for your possessions. Friendship was a luxury that could get you killed if you let your guard down around the wrong person. The bonds that held medieval society together dissolved under the pressure of survival. The promise of glory and honor that had originally inspired many crusaders turned into a bitter joke as the reality of siege warfare set in. There was no glory in dying of dysentery in a ditch outside a foreign city. There was no honor in massacring civilians who couldn't fight back. The romantic ideals of knighthood crumbled in the face of brutal necessity. Transportation of the wounded and sick was virtually impossible under campaign conditions. Men who could no longer march were left behind to die, regardless of their previous service or social status. The medieval concept of military medicine was so primitive that being wounded was essentially a death sentence unless you could treat yourself. The cultural barriers between Europeans and Middle Eastern populations created constant misunderstandings that often turned violent. Simple attempts at communication could be interpreted as threats or insults, leading to conflicts that escalated far beyond their original scope. Your understanding of time and distance would prove completely inadequate for the scale of crusading operations. Journeys that seemed manageable on crude maps turned into death marches across impossible terrain. What looked like a few days' travel often took weeks or months, if it was possible at all. The logistics of siege warfare were beyond the capabilities of medieval technology and organisation. Maintaining supply lines to static positions while under constant harassment from mobile enemy forces required resources and expertise that Crusader armies simply didn't possess. The psychological warfare employed by Muslim commanders was far more sophisticated than anything European minds could comprehend. They understood that breaking the will of Crusader armies was more effective than simply killing them. Night raids weren't designed to inflict maximum casualties. They were calculated to prevent sleep and create paranoia. The constant sound of drums, horns and war chants would echo across the desert for hours, keeping exhausted soldiers awake and on edge. Enemy forces would display the severed heads of captured crusaders on spears just within sight of Christian camps, They'd torture prisoners where their screams could be heard by their former comrades. Bodies would be mutilated and left in places where Crusader patrols would find them, each corpse a message about what awaited the living. The tactic of false retreats was perfected by Muslim cavalry who would feign defeat, draw Crusader forces into pursuit, then wheel around and slaughter the scattered Christians who'd broken formation, chasing what they thought was a fleeing enemy. Entire units would be wiped out by commanders who couldn't resist the temptation of an easy victory. Your water supplies would be poisoned or cut off entirely. Wells would be filled with corpses, making them unusable. Streams would be diverted or contaminated upstream. The enemy understood that Europeans were completely dependent on water sources and used this knowledge to devastating effect. Many Crusader armies died of thirst within sight of rivers they couldn't safely reach. The concept of guerrilla warfare was alien to European military thinking, which focused on pitched battles and siege operations. Muslim forces would strike supply trains, pick off stragglers, and melt back into the landscape before retaliation was possible. You'd march through apparently empty countryside while invisible enemies tracked your every movement. Climate adaptation separated survivors from corpses faster than any sword. Your body, evolved for cool, wet European conditions, would rebel against every aspect of Middle Eastern weather. The dry air would crack your skin until it bled. Your lips would split open and refuse to heal. Nosebleeds would become chronic as delicate nasal passages dried out completely. The intense UV radiation at desert altitudes would burn you through your armor, creating permanent scarring and increasing your risk of deadly skin infections. Many Crusaders went blind from the constant glare of sunlight reflecting off sand and stone. There were no sunglasses, no understanding of UV protection, just raw exposure to radiation levels that could kill. Temperature swings would destroy your equipment and your body simultaneously. Days hot enough to cook meat would be followed by nights cold enough to freeze water. Your armor would expand and contract, joints would seize up, and leather components would crack beyond repair. Meanwhile, your body would struggle to adapt to temperature variations that European physiology was never designed to handle. Dust storms would bury entire camps without warning. The fine sand would penetrate every piece of equipment, jamming mechanisms, ruining food supplies, and creating respiratory problems that could last for months. Men would suffocate on the dust in their own lungs while their equipment became unusable collections of sand-clogged metal. The biological warfare was primitive but effective. Diseased animal carcasses would be catapulted over city walls to spread plague among defenders. Human corpses would be thrown into water supplies to contaminate them. The concept of germ theory didn't exist, but the practical application of biological weapons was well understood by both sides. Your immune system, adapted to European diseases, would be helpless against Middle Eastern pathogens. Malaria, typhus, and dysentery would sweep through Crusader camps like wildfire. Men who'd survived everything Europe could throw at them would die within days of exposure to diseases their bodies had never encountered. The social hierarchy that had seemed so important back in Europe would collapse under the pressure of shared misery. Nobles would beg food from peasants. Knights would steal from their own squires. The feudal system that organised medieval society meant nothing when everyone was equally likely to die horribly at any moment. Language barriers created deadly confusion in combat situations. Battle orders would be misunderstood or completely lost in translation. Retreat signals would be missed by units that spoke different dialects. Coordinated attacks would fall apart because nobody could communicate effectively under pressure. The sound of battle itself was psychologically devastating. The screams of wounded men, the clash of metal on metal, the wet sounds of weapons cutting through flesh and bone, all combined to create an auditory hell that could break men's minds before their bodies failed. Your sense of direction would become completely unreliable in desert conditions. Landmarks would shift as sand dunes moved. The sun's position would be distorted by heat mirages. Stars would be obscured by dust and smoke. Many Crusader units would march in circles for days, slowly dying of thirst while their enemies watched from nearby hills. The economic reality of crusading meant that success required constant pillaging and looting just to survive. But the local populations quickly learned to hide their valuables and disappear whenever Christian armies approached. The easy wealth that had been promised turned out to be guarded by professional soldiers who knew the terrain and had every advantage. Medical triage was a concept that didn't exist in medieval warfare. The wounded would lie where they fell until they died or recovered on their own. Battlefield surgery consisted of amputation with carpenter's tools and prayer. Most men who survived their initial wounds would die from infection, blood loss, or shock within days. The spiritual crisis that developed as the reality of crusading set in was perhaps more devastating than any physical hardship. Men who'd left Europe believing they were serving God's will found themselves committing atrocities that violated every Christian teaching they'd ever learned. Sleep became a luxury that could get you killed. Constant vigilance was required to avoid night raids, theft by your own comrades, and the various predators, both human and animal, that stalked army camps after dark. Chronic exhaustion made decision-making impossible and reaction times fatally slow. The maintenance of weapons and armor required skills, tools, and materials that weren't available on campaign. Swords would dull from cutting through sand-filled cloth, armor would rust from humidity and blood, bowstrings would snap from heat and dryness. Your equipment would fail precisely when you needed it most. Navigation by dead reckoning was beyond the capabilities of most medieval commanders. Without accurate maps, compasses, or understanding of local geography, armies would march directly into impassable terrain or carefully prepared ambushes. Entire expeditions would simply vanish into the desert, leaving no trace of their fate. The psychological impact of witnessing mass death would fundamentally change your personality, assuming you survived long enough to develop one. Men would become numb to suffering, violence, and horror. The capacity for empathy would be burned out by exposure to atrocities that the human mind wasn't designed to process. Your personal possessions would be stripped away, piece by piece, as survival took precedence over sentiment. Family heirlooms would be traded for food. Religious artifacts would be sold for weapons. The connections to your old life would disappear until you became just another anonymous soldier dying in a foreign land. The tactical superiority of Muslim forces became apparent in every engagement. Their cavalry was faster and more maneuverable. Their archery was more accurate at longer ranges. Their knowledge of terrain gave them decisive advantages in every battle. European military traditions were not just inadequate, they were actively counterproductive. Disease vectors that didn't exist in Europe would spread death through crusader camps with terrifying efficiency. Insects carried pathogens that European immune systems had never encountered. Contaminated water sources would trigger epidemics that could destroy entire armies. The biological hazards were as deadly as any enemy weapon. The concept of strategic withdrawal was foreign to Crusader military thinking, which emphasized honor and glory over tactical sense. Commanders would order suicidal attacks rather than admit defeat. Units would be sacrificed to maintain the fiction of invincibility while practical military objectives went unachieved. Your mental map of warfare, developed from European conflicts, would be completely useless in Middle Eastern conditions. The tactics that worked against other European armies were not just ineffective, but actively dangerous when used against opponents who understood desert warfare. The logistics of medical evacuation were impossible under medieval conditions. Wounded men who couldn't march were left behind to die, regardless of their rank or previous service. The concept of battlefield medicine was so primitive that being injured was essentially a death sentence. Communication with home was non-existent for most of the duration of a crusade. You would have no way of knowing if your family was alive or dead, if your property still existed, or if there was even a home to return to. The psychological isolation was complete and devastating. The religious justifications for violence became increasingly elaborate as the gap between Christian teaching and Crusader behavior widened. Theologians would invent new doctrines to explain why massacring civilians was actually serving God's will, creating a twisted logic that allowed mass murder while maintaining the fiction of holy war. Your understanding of military engineering would prove completely inadequate for siege operations in the Middle East. European castle design was irrelevant when facing superior Muslim fortifications. Siege techniques that worked against wooden palisades failed catastrophically against sophisticated stone defences. The economic exploitation by everyone involved in the crusading enterprise was systematic and ruthless. Ship captains would charge exorbitant rates for passage, then abandon passengers at the first sign of trouble. Local rulers would demand tribute for safe passage, then attack the same armies once payment was made. Weather patterns that European experience couldn't predict would destroy armies without warning. Seasonal rains would turn rivers into impassable torrents. Drought would dry up water sources that maps indicated were reliable. Temperature extremes would kill more efficiently than any human enemy. The cultural sophistication of Middle Eastern cities was a shock that shattered European assumptions about civilization. Damascus, Baghdad, and Cairo had libraries, hospitals, and universities, while most Europeans couldn't read. The technological and intellectual superiority of Islamic civilization was undeniable and humiliating. Your personal hygiene would deteriorate to levels that became health hazards in themselves. Without soap, clean water, or understanding of basic sanitation, you would become a walking disease vector. The smell alone would make stealth operations impossible and mark you as a target for enemy forces. The concept of military intelligence was virtually unknown to Crusader armies. They would march blindly into territory where every move was observed and reported to enemy commanders. Muslim forces had extensive spy networks, while Christians operated in complete ignorance of enemy capabilities and intentions. Supply line protection required more troops than most Crusader armies could spare. Baggage trains stretched for miles and moved at the pace of the slowest ox cart, while attracting raiders like carrion draw's vultures. Protecting your supplies meant spreading forces dangerously thin across impossible distances. The technological gap between European and Islamic military equipment became apparent in every engagement. Muslim metallurgy produced superior weapons and armour. Their siege engines were more effective and reliable. Their understanding of logistics far exceeded anything Europeans could manage. Your social bonds would dissolve under the pressure of survival competition. Friends would steal food from each other. Brothers would abandon siblings who couldn't keep up with the march. The fellowship that supposedly motivated the Crusades evaporated when resources became scarce, and death was the alternative to selfishness. The promise of martyrdom and salvation that had originally inspired many crusaders began to ring hollow when faced with the reality of what holy war actually required. The gap between religious rhetoric and brutal necessity created a psychological crisis that destroyed faith more effectively than any enemy action. Terrain analysis was beyond the capabilities of medieval military science. Armies would march into box canyons with no escape routes. They would attempt to cross deserts without adequate water supplies. They would position themselves in locations that enemy forces could surround and destroy at will. The seasonal limitations of medieval warfare meant that campaigns had to be completed within narrow windows of opportunity. Miss those windows due to delays, disease, or tactical failures, and entire armies would be trapped in impossible positions during the worst possible weather conditions. Your equipment would become instruments of torture as conditions deteriorated. Armor would heat up until it branded your flesh. Weapons would become too heavy to lift effectively. The tools designed to protect you would become burdens that hastened your death rather than preventing it. The medical understanding of wound treatment was so primitive that injuries were often made worse by attempted treatment. Battlefield surgeons would introduce deadly infections while trying to help. Amputations performed with rusty tools usually resulted in death from blood loss or gangrene within days of the operation. Strategic planning was impossible without accurate intelligence about enemy capabilities, terrain features, weather patterns, and local political situations. Crusader armies operated in complete ignorance of the factors that determined success or failure in Middle Eastern warfare. The psychological impact of cultural displacement was severe and permanent. Men who'd grown up in small European villages found themselves in vast alien cities with incomprehensible customs, languages, and social structures. The cognitive dissonance was enough to drive many completely insane. Your daily caloric needs would far exceed what medieval logistics could provide under campaign conditions. The physical demands of marching in armor, fighting in extreme heat, and maintaining constant vigilance required nutrition levels that were simply impossible to achieve with available food supplies. Disease prevention was not a concept that existed in medieval military thinking. Armies would camp in locations that were perfect breeding grounds for pathogens. They would use contaminated water sources because they had no understanding of how disease spread. The ignorance was literally deadly. The return journey home was often more dangerous than the original eastward march because local populations now knew exactly what Crusader armies were capable of and had every reason to seek revenge. Many veterans who survived years of warfare died within sight of home, killed by people they'd brutalized on the way out. The economic realities of crusading would bankrupt you before you ever reached the Holy Land. Medieval campaigns weren't government-funded operations with regular paychecks and supply drops. You financed your own holy war, selling everything you owned just to afford basic equipment and passage east. A decent sword cost more than most peasants earned in a year. A suit of mail could bankrupt a small village, and that was just the beginning of your expenses. Ship captains charged whatever they wanted for passage to the Levant, knowing that desperate crusaders had no alternatives. They'd pack vessels beyond safe capacity, provide minimal food and water, and abandon passengers at the first sign of trouble. Many would-be holy warriors died in shipwrecks, caused by overloading and inexperienced navigation long before they ever saw a Muslim. Local rulers along the route demanded tribute for safe passage through their territories. What they called protection fees you'd recognize as extortion. Pay up or face harassment, delayed supplies, and mysterious attacks by bandits who seemed remarkably well informed about your army's movements and vulnerabilities. Money changers were professional thieves operating under the protection of local authorities. They'd exchange your European silver for local currency at rates that would make modern loan sharks blush. What seemed like adequate funds back home would evaporate into worthless metal discs that bought you nothing but contempt from merchants who knew exactly how desperate you were. The cost of living in foreign territories was deliberately inflated whenever Christian armies appeared. A loaf of bread that cost pennies for locals would suddenly require silver coins when sold to crusaders. Water, the most basic necessity for survival, became a luxury item priced beyond the reach of common soldiers. Even if you somehow managed your finances perfectly, the economics of warfare would destroy you anyway. Weapons broke and couldn't be repaired without expensive materials and skilled craftsmen. Armor required constant maintenance that ate through your remaining funds. Horses, if you were wealthy enough to own one, needed food and care that cost more than feeding a family back home. The promised spoils of war turned out to be mostly fictional. Successful looting required successful battles, and successful battles required surviving long enough to fight them. The wealthy eastern cities that were supposed to make everyone rich were defended by professional armies with every possible advantage over European amateurs. Medical expenses could bankrupt even wealthy nobles overnight. A simple wound infection might require treatment with imported medicines that cost more than a year's wages. Surgery, assuming you could find someone willing to attempt it, involved fees that would strip you of everything valuable you'd managed to keep. Your social status back home meant absolutely nothing in the face of Middle Eastern military realities. Knights who'd been lords of their own manors found themselves taking orders from whoever happened to be alive and competent at any given moment. The feudal hierarchy that organised European society collapsed under the pressure of shared misery and constant threat. Communication breakdowns weren't just inconvenient, they were deadly. Battle orders got lost in translation between languages nobody fully understood. Retreat signals were missed by units that spoke different dialects. Coordinated attacks fell apart because effective communication under combat stress was essentially impossible. The religious politics were more complex and dangerous than European understanding could grasp. Eastern Orthodox Christians viewed Western Catholics with suspicion and often open hostility. Local Christian populations frequently sided with Muslim rulers against Crusader armies, not from religious conviction, but because they knew who would still be there after the Europeans died or went home. Crusader states that were eventually established were military colonies surrounded by hostile populations and dependent on constant reinforcement from Europe that rarely came. If you survived the initial conquest and decided to stay, you'd spend the rest of your life in a fortress mentality, never more than a few miles from people who wanted to reclaim their land and exact revenge for years of occupation. The technological superiority that European armies assumed they possessed proved to be largely imaginary. Muslim metallurgy produced weapons and armour that were often superior to European designs. Eastern siege engines were more sophisticated and effective than anything Western engineers could build. Local knowledge of terrain and climate trumped European military traditions in every engagement. Your daily routine would become a grinding cycle of misery designed to break both body and spirit. Wake before dawn to the sound of horns and shouting officers. Force down whatever spoiled food you could scavenge or afford. March for hours in badly fitting armour that grew heavier with each step. Fight or prepare to fight while knowing that medical treatment for injuries was primitive at best. Try to find shelter and edible food in hostile territory. Attempt to sleep while listening for sounds of approaching enemies or thieves from your own ranks. The concept of personal space or privacy didn't exist under campaign conditions. You'd share cramped tents with men who hadn't bathed in months. Every bodily function became a public event. The smell of unwashed bodies, rotting food, and human waste would become so overwhelming that approaching armies could be detected from miles away. Sleep deprivation was used as a weapon by Muslim commanders who understood European weaknesses better than Europeans understood themselves. Night raids weren't designed for maximum casualties, but for psychological warfare. The constant threat of attack meant that exhausted soldiers rarely got more than a few hours of interrupted rest, leading to poor decision-making and fatal mistakes in combat. The armour that was supposed to protect you would become a death trap in desert conditions. Male hauberks would heat up in the sun until they literally branded your flesh. Helmets became ovens that cooked your brain. The weight distribution of medieval armour wasn't designed for extended marching in extreme heat, leading to joint damage and spinal injuries that left men permanently crippled. Weapon maintenance was nearly impossible under campaign conditions. Swords were dull from cutting through sand-filled cloth and couldn't be properly sharpened without access to quality whetstones and skilled smiths. Crossbow strings would snap from heat and humidity. Spear points would bend or break, leaving you with expensive clubs instead of effective weapons. The logistics of moving large armies through hostile territory exceeded the capabilities of medieval technology and organisation. Baggage trains stretched for miles, moved at the pace of the slowest ox cart, and attracted raiders who could strike and disappear before retaliation was possible. Protecting supply lines meant spreading forces dangerously thin across impossible distances. Intelligence gathering was primitive when it existed at all. You'd march toward objectives based on information that was weeks or months old. Cities might be reinforced, abandoned, or never existed in the first place. Maps were inaccurate when they existed, leading armies into dead ends, impassable terrain, and carefully prepared ambushes. The seasonal limitations of medieval warfare created narrow windows of opportunity that were easy to miss. Campaign during the hot months and die of heat stroke. March during the rainy season and get bogged down in flooding and mud. The brief periods of suitable weather gave enemy forces plenty of time to prepare defences and gather intelligence about Crusader movements. Medical understanding was so primitive that treatment often made injuries worse rather than better. Battlefield surgeons would pack wounds with whatever material was available, usually introducing deadly infections in the process. Pain management consisted of alcohol if you were lucky, prayer if you weren't, and biting leather straps while someone did horrible things to your body with rusty tools. The psychological impact of constant exposure to violence and death was devastating and permanent. You'd watch friends die horrible deaths from wounds, disease, or simple exhaustion. After months of this, many crusaders simply stopped forming emotional attachments to fellow soldiers. The numbness that followed was its own kind of death. Cultural barriers created constant misunderstandings that often escalated into deadly conflicts. Simple attempts at communication could be interpreted as threats or insults. Hand gestures that were friendly in Europe might be mortal insults in the Middle East. The potential for fatal miscommunication was present in every interaction with local populations. The promise of spiritual rewards for crusading began to seem hollow when faced with the reality of what holy war actually required. Massacring civilians, enslaving children, and destroying religious sites created a psychological crisis that shattered many men's faith entirely. The gap between religious rhetoric and brutal necessity was impossible to reconcile. Your understanding of time and distance would prove completely inadequate for the scale of crusading operations. Journeys that looked manageable on crude maps turned into death marches across impossible terrain. What appeared to be a few days' travel often took weeks or months, assuming it was possible at all. The hierarchy of suffering that developed during supply shortages revealed the hollow nature of Christian brotherhood. Nobles ate while common soldiers starved. Knights received medical treatment while peasants were left to die. Social rank determined who lived and who died when resources became scarce. Disease moved through crusader camps with the efficiency of biological warfare. Cholera would kill dozens overnight. Plague would decimate entire units before moving on to fresh victims. There were no vaccines, no antibiotics, and no understanding of how diseases spread or how to prevent them. Medieval medical theory was not just useless, it was actively harmful. The economic incentives that had motivated many crusaders disappeared as soon as they realized that the wealth of the East wasn't lying around waiting to be collected. Successful pillaging required military victories, and military victories required surviving long enough to achieve them. The easy riches promised by recruiters turned out to be propaganda that bore no resemblance to reality. Navigation in unfamiliar territory was beyond the capabilities of most medieval commanders. Desert landmarks would shift as sand dunes moved. Heat mirages would distort distance and direction. Stars would be obscured by dust storms and smoke from fires. Entire armies would march in circles for days, slowly dying of thirst while enemies watched from nearby positions. The concept of military discipline varied wildly between different national contingents within the same army. French knights operated under completely different rules than German infantry. Italian crossbowmen had nothing in common with English archers. When crisis struck, these differences exploded into armed conflicts that could shatter an army faster than enemy action. Your personal possessions would disappear one by one as survival took precedence over sentiment. Family heirlooms would be traded for food. Religious artifacts would be sold for weapons. The connections to your former life would vanish until you became just another anonymous soldier dying in a foreign land for reasons you could no longer remember. The technological gap between European and Middle Eastern civilization was humiliating and deadly. Muslim siege engines could breach walls that European equipment couldn't even damage. Islamic medicine could treat injuries that would be death sentences under Christian care. The intellectual and technological superiority of Eastern cultures was undeniable and crushing to European pride. Weather extremes would kill more efficiently than any human enemy. Temperature swings from scorching days to freezing nights would destroy both equipment and human physiology. Sandstorms would bury camps and suffocate men in their own tents. Flash floods would wash away entire armies without warning. The biological hazards of Middle Eastern warfare were completely unknown to European immune systems. Malaria, typhus, and dozens of other diseases would sweep through Christian armies like wildfire through dry grass. Men who'd survived everything Europe could produce would die within days of exposure to pathogens their bodies had never encountered. Supply shortages created competition for resources that turned former allies into deadly rivals. Units would fight each other for access to water sources, while enemy forces watched and waited for the perfect moment to attack the weakened survivors. The unity that was supposed to characterize holy war evaporated the moment basic necessities became scarce. The sound environment of medieval combat was psychologically devastating in ways that modern people can barely comprehend. The screams of wounded and dying men, the clash of metal weapons, the wet sounds of blades cutting through flesh and bone, all combined to create an auditory hell that could break minds before bodies failed. Your social relationships would deteriorate as rapidly as your physical condition. Trust became impossible when anyone might kill you for food or water. Friendship was a luxury that could prove fatal if you let your guard down around the wrong person. The bonds that held medieval society together dissolved completely under the pressure of survival. The maintenance requirements for medieval military equipment exceeded what was possible under campaign conditions. Leather components would crack and rot in the heat. Metal fittings would rust from humidity and blood. Fabric elements would disintegrate from constant wear and poor cleaning. Your gear would fall apart precisely when you needed it most. The psychological warfare employed by Muslim forces was sophisticated beyond anything European minds could comprehend or counter. They understood that breaking the will of Crusader armies was more effective than simply killing them. The constant psychological pressure was designed to create paranoia, exhaust mental resources, and destroy unit cohesion. Disease prevention was not a concept that existed in medieval military thinking. Armies would establish camps in locations that were perfect breeding grounds for pathogens. They would use obviously contaminated water sources because they had no understanding of how diseases spread. The ignorance was systematically and literally deadly. The return journey home was often more dangerous than the original eastward march because local populations had learned exactly what Crusader armies were capable of and had every reason to seek revenge. Veterans who survived years of warfare often died within sight of Europe, killed by people seeking justice for atrocities committed during the outbound journey. The concept of enemy intelligence networks was something European commanders never fully grasped until it was far too late. While Crusader armies stumbled blindly through unfamiliar territory, Muslim forces operated extensive spy networks that tracked every Christian movement from the moment they set foot in the Levant. Local populations, merchants, servants, and even supposed allies fed information to enemy commanders who could plan ambushes, defensive strategies, and counterattacks with perfect knowledge of Crusader capabilities and intentions. You'd wake up to find that the enemy somehow knew exactly when you planned to move camp, which routes you intended to take, and what your supply situation looked like. Meanwhile, your own commanders were operating in complete ignorance of enemy troop movements, defensive preparations, and strategic intentions. It was like playing chess while blindfolded against opponents who could see every piece on the board. The sophistication of Muslim military intelligence made European attempts at reconnaissance look pathetically amateur. Crusader scouts would venture out and return with contradictory reports based on limited observations. Muslim intelligence operatives would infiltrate Christian camps, gather detailed information about morale, supplies, and leadership disputes, then disappear without trace. Your army would march confidently toward what seemed like a weakly defended position, only to discover it was a carefully prepared killing ground with hidden archers, concealed cavalry, and escape routes blocked by forces that had been waiting in ambush for days. The psychological impact of repeatedly walking into traps was devastating to morale and military effectiveness. Even your own servants and camp followers couldn't be trusted. Many were local inhabitants who'd taken employment with Crusader armies specifically to gather intelligence for Muslim commanders. The cook preparing your meals might be counting your numbers and assessing your equipment. The guide leading you through mountain passes could be directing you into carefully prepared ambushes. The economic warfare was just as sophisticated as the military intelligence. Muslim forces would manipulate local markets to drive up prices for goods that Christian armies desperately needed. They'd buy up available supplies before Crusader purchasing agents could reach them. They'd spread false information about trade routes and supply sources, leading European armies into commercial dead ends where nothing was available at any price. Currency manipulation was another weapon in their arsenal. Local money changers would suddenly refuse to accept European silver, claiming it was debased or counterfeit. Exchange rates would fluctuate wildly based on military developments, leaving Crusader armies with bags of worthless metal when they needed to purchase essential supplies. The medical warfare was particularly insidious because it exploited European ignorance about tropical diseases and basic sanitation. Muslim forces would contaminate water sources upstream from Crusader camps, introducing pathogens that would devastate Christian armies while leaving local populations, who had developed immunity, relatively unaffected. They'd drive diseased animals into areas where European armies were likely to forage, spreading plague and other infectious diseases through the food chain. They'd time their attacks to coincide with seasonal disease outbreaks, knowing that Crusader armies would be weakened by illness and unable to respond effectively. The siege warfare techniques employed by Muslim defenders were centuries ahead of European understanding. They'd built elaborate tunnel systems beneath their cities, allowing them to move troops and supplies without being observed by Christian besiegers. They could launch surprise attacks from underground, appearing behind Crusader siege lines without warning. Counter-siege engineering was a specialty that European armies had never encountered. Muslim defenders would tunnel beneath Christian siege engines and collapse them from below. They'd use superior mathematics and engineering to calculate exactly where enemy trebuchets would be positioned, then prepare defensive measures that could neutralize them before they became effective. The use of Greek fire and other incendiary weapons was devastating to European forces who had no effective countermeasures. These mysterious substances would stick to armor and continue burning even when submerged in water. The psychological impact of watching comrades burn alive in their own protective gear was often more damaging than the actual casualties inflicted. Your understanding of fortification design would prove completely inadequate when faced with the sophisticated defensive architecture of Middle Eastern cities. European castles were built to withstand attacks by other Europeans using familiar siege techniques. Muslim fortifications were designed by engineers who understood the full range of siege warfare possibilities. The walls weren't just higher and thicker, they were built with angles and curves that deflected projectiles and created killing zones for defenders. The gates weren't simple openings that could be battered down, they were elaborate maze-like structures designed to trap and slaughter attackers. The defensive positions were integrated into a comprehensive system that turned entire cities into weapons. Water management within besieged cities was so sophisticated that Christian forces would often run out of water before the defenders they were supposedly starving out. Underground cisterns, hidden springs, and elaborate distribution systems meant that Muslim cities could withstand sieges that would have forced European settlements to surrender within weeks. The psychological pressure of besieging enemies who seemed to have unlimited resources while your own supplies dwindled was crushing. You'd watch defenders on the walls eating fresh food and drinking clean water, while your own army slowly starved outside their gates. The realization that you were the one being besieged, not the city, would gradually dawn on commanders who'd expected easy victories. Religious warfare took forms that European Christian understanding couldn't comprehend or effectively counter. Muslim armies included scholars and theologians who could engage in sophisticated theological debates with captured Christian priests, often converting them or at least undermining their faith in the Crusader cause. The concept of jihad was far more nuanced and strategically flexible than European propaganda had suggested. Muslim commanders could mobilize religious fervor when it served their purposes, but they could also negotiate pragmatic truces, form temporary alliances with Christian forces against other Muslim rulers, and adapt their strategies based on political rather than purely religious considerations. Your rigid understanding of holy war as a simple conflict between Christianity and Islam would prove completely inadequate for navigating the complex political and religious landscape of the Middle East. Sunni and Shia Muslims fought each other as often as they fought Christians. Local Christian populations had their own agendas that didn't align with European objectives. Jewish communities played their own political games that cut across religious boundaries. The diplomatic skills required to operate effectively in this environment were completely beyond the capabilities of most European commanders, who thought in terms of simple conquest and religious conversion rather than the subtle political maneuvering that actually determined success or failure in the region. Supply line interdiction was an art form that Muslim forces had perfected through centuries of warfare against various enemies. They didn't just attack Crusader baggage trains. They systematically destroyed the infrastructure that made long-distance military operations possible. Roads would be blocked, bridges would be destroyed, wells would be poisoned, and local populations would be evacuated or hidden. The result was that European armies would find themselves marching through empty countryside where nothing was available and everything they needed had to be carried with them. The logistical burden became impossible to sustain over the distances and time periods required for successful campaigning. Foraging became a deadly game of hide-and-seek, where Crusader soldiers would venture out to search for food and supplies, only to discover that everything valuable had been removed or destroyed days before their arrival. The few items that remained were often booby-trapped or poisoned, turning the search for sustenance into a form of Russian roulette. The seasonal warfare patterns that Muslim commanders understood and exploited were completely alien to European military thinking. They knew exactly when and where various diseases would peak, when water sources would be reliable, when weather conditions would favour different types of military operations, and how to time their campaigns to maximise environmental advantages. European armies would arrive at their destinations during the worst possible conditions, having marched through territory during seasons when travel was most difficult and dangerous. They'd find themselves fighting major battles during weather that favoured their enemies and hindered their own tactical advantages. The cultural sensitivity required to operate effectively in the Middle East was completely absent from Crusader training and mindset. European soldiers would unknowingly commit acts that were considered blasphemous or deeply offensive by local standards, turning potential allies into deadly enemies through simple ignorance. Religious customs, dietary restrictions, social hierarchies, and commercial practices that seemed insignificant to European minds were matters of life and death importance to Middle Eastern populations. A crusader's casual disregard for local sensibilities could trigger violent reactions that would spread far beyond the original incident. The technological adaptation required for desert warfare was beyond the capabilities of medieval European industry and knowledge. Armour designs that worked well in temperate climates became death traps in extreme heat. Weapons that were effective against European opponents proved inadequate against Middle Eastern defensive techniques and materials. even basic equipment like water containers, cooking utensils, and tent designs had to be completely reconsidered for desert conditions. European armies were essentially trying to conduct advanced military operations using Stone Age technology adapted for completely different environmental conditions. Your personal survival would depend on skills that no European had ever needed to develop. Desert navigation, water location and purification, heat injury prevention, sandstorm survival, and dozens of other specialized techniques that could only be learned through experience that most crusaders didn't live long enough to acquire. The learning curve was so steep and the consequences of mistakes so severe that most European soldiers died during the educational process. Those few who did manage to adapt often found that their hard-won knowledge was useless when they were transferred to different regions with different challenges. The command structure chaos that plagued Crusader armies was systematically exploited by Muslim forces who understood European political weaknesses better than Europeans understood them themselves. They would deliberately provoke disputes between different national contingents, exploit personal rivalries between commanders, and time their attacks to coincide with periods when Christian leadership was paralyzed by internal conflicts. The political intelligence that Muslim commanders possessed about European noble families, their alliances, their feuds, and their personal characteristics was often more detailed and accurate than what European commanders knew about each other. This knowledge was used to craft propaganda, diplomatic overtures, and military strategies specifically designed to exploit Christian weaknesses. Your daily survival would become a complex calculation involving factors that European life had never prepared you to consider. How much water could you safely drink without risking illness? Which foods were safe to eat, and which would trigger violent digestive reactions? How could you maintain essential equipment when replacement parts and repair materials weren't available? The simple act of staying alive required constant decision-making based on incomplete information about unfamiliar threats. A wrong choice about where to camp, what to eat, or which route to take could result in death for entire units. The margin for error was so small that even experienced soldiers made fatal mistakes regularly. The psychological warfare continued even during periods of apparent peace or truce. Muslim forces would use negotiation periods to gather intelligence, rest their forces, and prepare for renewed attacks while European commanders mistakenly believed that temporary truces indicated permanent changes in enemy intentions. The diplomatic protocols and cultural expectations surrounding negotiations were so different from European practices that Crusader representatives often unknowingly insulted their counterparts or agreed to terms they didn't understand. The complexity of Middle Eastern diplomatic practice made every attempt at negotiation a potential disaster. Your mental health would deteriorate under pressures that medieval society had no framework for understanding or treating. Constant stress, sleep deprivation, malnutrition, repeated trauma exposure, and social isolation would create psychological conditions that had no names and no treatments in the medieval world. The stigma attached to mental breakdown meant that soldiers showing signs of psychological distress were often treated as cowards or possessed by demons rather than victims of unbearable stress. This made recovery even less likely and added shame and rejection to the burden of psychological injury. The long-term consequences of crusading extended far beyond the immediate military campaign. Veterans who survived and returned home carried physical disabilities, psychological trauma, and social alienation that would affect them and their families for generations. The cost of holy war wasn't just measured in immediate casualties, but in the permanent damage done to individuals and communities. Many returned crusaders found that their experiences had changed them so fundamentally that they could no longer function in peaceful European society. They'd been trained for violence, exposed to atrocities, and stripped of normal human emotional responses. The skills that kept them alive during the Crusades made them dangerous and unpredictable in civilian life. The economic impact on European communities was devastating and long-lasting. Entire villages would sell everything they owned to finance local men's participation in crusading expeditions. When those men died or returned empty-handed, the communities faced bankruptcy and social collapse that could take generations to recover from. The human cost of the Crusades wasn't limited to the battlefields of the Middle East. European families were destroyed, local economies collapsed, and social structures were damaged by the massive investment in military adventures that produced no lasting benefits for the communities that financed them. The technological and medical knowledge that could have been gained through peaceful contact with Middle Eastern civilization was largely lost due to the hostile nature of the crusading encounter. Instead of learning from more advanced cultures, European armies focused on destroying and looting, missing opportunities for advancement that wouldn't come again for centuries. The legacy of the Crusades was mutual hatred, cultural misunderstanding, and military failure rather than the religious triumph and cultural exchange that could have benefited both civilizations. The violence and brutality of the crusading period created wounds that would influence European-Middle Eastern relations for centuries to come. Your participation in this historical catastrophe would have contributed to one of the most destructive and pointless military adventures in human history. Rather than advancing Christian civilization or protecting European interests, the Crusades damaged both cultures and created patterns of conflict that persist to this day. The romantic mythology that later developed around crusading bore no resemblance to the reality of what participants actually experienced. The knights in shining armor, the noble quests, and the glorious victories existed only in the imagination of people who'd never witnessed the brutal reality of medieval warfare in impossible conditions. If you'd somehow survived the entire experience and lived to old age, you would have spent your final years knowing that you'd participated in a massive historical failure that accomplished nothing positive and caused immense suffering for everyone involved. The glory that never existed would be replaced by the bitter knowledge that you'd wasted your life on a lie that got millions of people killed for no good reason. The simple truth that medieval people couldn't acknowledge was that the Crusades were military, political, economic, and moral disasters that weakened European civilization while failing to achieve any of their stated objectives. Your death in the desert would have been just another pointless tragedy in a series of pointless tragedies that stretched across centuries of misguided religious warfare. The reality is that everything about crusading was designed to kill you, and the methods were as varied as they were inevitable. Your death wouldn't come as a glorious charge against infidel armies with banners flying and trumpets sounding. It would come quietly, miserably, probably while you were squatting behind a rock trying to deal with another bout of dysentery that had been plaguing you for weeks. The most likely scenario for your demise was simple starvation, not the dramatic kind where you waste away over months while making noble speeches about faith and duty. The brutal kind where your body starts consuming itself after your last handful of spoiled grain runs out. Your muscles would atrophy first, leaving you too weak to carry your weapons or armor. Your mind would follow, creating hallucinations of food that would drive you to eat things that would finish the job even faster. Many crusaders died from drinking their own urine when water ran out, not understanding that it would accelerate dehydration rather than prevent it. Others would eat leather, bark, grass, anything that seemed like it might provide sustenance. The human digestive system wasn't designed to process these materials, leading to intestinal blockages that caused agonizing deaths over days or weeks. Cannibalism wasn't an abstract horror that happened to other armies in distant places. It was a regular occurrence during prolonged sieges or desert crossings when supply lines collapsed completely. The siege of Antioch saw Christian soldiers eating the flesh of Muslim defenders when their food stores were exhausted. Contemporary chroniclers recorded these events as matter-of-fact tactical decisions rather than moral catastrophes. Your own comrades would eye you appraisingly when rations ran low, calculating how much meat your body might provide and whether you were weak enough to be safely attacked. The bonds of Christian fellowship would evaporate the moment survival became the only consideration. Men who'd sworn sacred oaths together would kill each other over scraps of rotten food. The water situation was even more desperate than the food crisis. European armies had no understanding of desert hydration requirements or water purification techniques. They'd drink from any source that looked clear, not realizing that parasites, bacteria, and chemical contamination could kill them days or weeks later. The delayed symptoms meant that by the time you realized the water was poisoned, entire units had already consumed lethal doses. Desert mirages would drive men insane with false hope. You'd see what appeared to be a clear lake in the distance and break ranks to reach it, only to find nothing but sand and rocks. The psychological impact of repeated disappointment would shatter minds that were already strained by heat, exhaustion, and the constant threat of death. Some crusaders would dig desperately in dry riverbeds, convinced that water must be somewhere beneath the surface. They'd excavate holes with their bare hands until their fingernails tore off and their palms bled, finding nothing but more sand. Others would follow animal tracks for miles, hoping they led to water sources, only to discover the animals they were tracking had died of thirst days earlier. The heat-related deaths were particularly cruel because they happened gradually and obviously, giving you plenty of time to understand exactly how you were going to die. Heat exhaustion would start with dizziness and nausea. Heat stroke would follow with confusion, hallucinations, and loss of motor control. Your body temperature would rise until your brain literally cooked inside your skull. Many crusaders died when they removed their armor to escape the heat, only to be killed by the first enemy patrol they encountered. Others died because they kept their armor on and were essentially baked alive inside metal ovens that reached temperatures no human body could survive. There was no right choice, only different ways to die. The sandstorms were meteorological death sentences that could strike without warning and last for days. The fine particles would penetrate every piece of equipment, clogging weapons, ruining food supplies, and creating respiratory problems that could kill you slowly over weeks. Many crusaders suffocated on the sand in their own lungs, while their equipment became unusable collections of gritty metal. You couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction during major sandstorms. Units would become separated and lost, wandering in circles until they died of thirst or walked off cliffs they couldn't see approaching. The sand would strip exposed skin raw, creating wounds that would become infected in the unsanitary conditions of army camps. The insects were vectors of diseases that European immune systems had never encountered and couldn't fight off. Mosquitoes carried malaria that would kill you with fever, chills, and organ failure. Flies spread dysentery that would empty your bowels until you died of dehydration and electrolyte imbalance. Fleas transmitted plague that would kill you with swollen lymph nodes and internal bleeding. Even minor insect bites could become major medical crises when they became infected. A simple mosquito bite could develop into a spreading infection that would require amputation if you were lucky enough to find someone willing and able to perform the surgery. More often, you'd just die slowly as the infection spread through your bloodstream. The scorpions and snakes were additional threats that European soldiers had no experience recognizing or avoiding. A single scorpion sting could kill you within hours if you had an allergic reaction. Snake bites would cause tissue death, organ failure, and agonizing pain that no medieval painkiller could touch. Many crusaders died from venomous encounters while trying to find shelter or gather firewood. The psychological breakdown that preceded many deaths was perhaps worse than the physical dying. Men would lose their minds from the combination of heat, dehydration, malnutrition, and constant stress. They'd start talking to imaginary companions, seeing enemies that didn't exist, or simply walking away from their units into the desert to die alone. Some would develop what we'd now recognize as severe PTSD from witnessing constant death and violence. They'd become catatonic, unable to speak or respond to orders. Others would become violently aggressive, attacking their own comrades over imagined slights or perceived threats. The medieval understanding of mental illness was essentially non-existent, so these men were usually abandoned or killed by their own units. The religious crisis that developed as reality diverged from expectation was spiritually devastating. Men who'd left Europe believing they were doing God's work found themselves committing atrocities that violated every Christian principle they'd been taught. The cognitive dissonance between religious belief and military necessity broke many minds completely. You'd watch priests blessing the weapons used to massacre civilian populations. You'd hear theologians explaining why rape and pillage were actually serving divine purposes. The gap between Christian teaching and Crusader behaviour would grow so wide that many participants lost their faith entirely, dying as bitter atheists in a war they'd joined as devout believers. The diseases that swept through Crusader camps were more deadly than any enemy army. Cholera would kill healthy men within hours of the first symptoms appearing. Typhus would cause high fevers, delirium, and organ failure that no medieval treatment could address. Smallpox would leave survivors permanently disfigured and partially blind, assuming they survived at all. The medical treatment available was often worse than no treatment at all. Battlefield surgeons would introduce deadly infections while trying to help. They'd amputate limbs with dirty tools, pacinated materials, and press wounds with contamrib treatments that would accelerate death rather than prevent it. Many wounded crusaders died from medical care rather than their original injuries. The siege warfare that dominated most campaigns was particularly brutal for common soldiers who did the actual fighting and dying. You'd spend months slowly starving outside enemy walls while defenders dropped stones, boiling oil, and worse substances on your head. The psychological pressure of being trapped in a static position while gradually weakening was crushing to morale and military effectiveness. Scaling ladders were essentially death sentences, disguised as military equipment. You'd climb up flimsy wooden constructions while people above tried to push them away from walls, drop rocks on your head, or set the entire apparatus on fire. Most ladder assaults failed spectacularly, leaving piles of broken bodies at the base of enemy fortifications. The tunnel warfare that developed during prolonged sieges was claustrophobic nightmare fuel that killed men in darkness hundreds of feet underground. You'd dig toward enemy foundations while listening for sounds of counter-tunnels being excavated to intercept you. When the tunnels met, the result was violent hand-to-hand combat fought with shovels and knives in spaces too small to swing swords. Many miners died when their tunnels collapsed from poor construction or enemy sabotage. Others suffocated from lack of oxygen or died from cave-ins caused by enemy counter-mining operations. The bodies were usually left where they fell because retrieving them would require digging new tunnels that might also collapse. The siege engines themselves were dangerous to their own operators as much as to enemy defenders. Catapults would malfunction and crush the men working them. Trebuchets would throw stones backward into friendly forces when counterweights shifted unexpectedly. The massive wooden machines were prone to catastrophic failures that could kill dozens of operators in seconds. Even successful siege operations usually ended in massacres that spared no one inside the captured city. When walls were finally breached, the pent-up frustration and bloodlust of months of siege warfare would explode into orgies of violence that shocked even contemporary observers who were accustomed to medieval brutality. The aftermath of successful sieges was often deadlier than the siege itself. Cities that had been cut off from supply lines for months would have massive sanitation problems that created perfect breeding grounds for disease. Crusader armies that occupied these urban disease factories would be decimated by epidemics within weeks of their supposed victories. The journey home, for those few who survived long enough to attempt it, was often more dangerous than the original eastward march. You'd be travelling through territories that now knew exactly what Crusader armies were capable of, populated by people who had every reason to seek revenge for years of brutality and occupation. Local populations that had been terrorized during the outbound journey would have had years to prepare ambushes, poison water sources, and organize resistance networks. Many Crusader veterans who survived years of warfare in the Holy Land died within sight of Europe, killed by people seeking justice for atrocities committed during the initial invasion. The few who did make it home often found that their families had given them up for dead and moved on with their lives. Wives had remarried, children had been raised by other men, and properties had been sold or redistributed. The communities they'd left no longer had room for traumatized veterans who'd been permanently changed by their experiences. The physical disabilities that crusading left on survivors were permanent reminders of their failed adventure. Joint damage from carrying heavy armour across thousands of miles, respiratory problems from breathing desert dust and siege smoke, digestive issues from years of poor diet and contaminated water, and countless other health problems that medieval medicine couldn't treat or understand. The psychological trauma was even worse because medieval society had no framework for understanding or treating what we'd now recognise as severe PTSD. Veterans who couldn't sleep, couldn't form relationships, couldn't function in peaceful society were viewed as cowards or possessed by demons rather than victims of unbearable stress. Many returned crusaders became hermits, bandits, or simply drifted from place to place as broken men who couldn't integrate back into civilian life. The skills that had kept them alive during the Crusades made them dangerous and unpredictable in European communities that valued stability and predictability. The economic impact on their home communities was devastating and long-lasting. Villages that had invested everything in financing local men's participation in crusading expeditions faced bankruptcy when those men died or returned empty-handed. The social fabric of entire regions was damaged by the massive investment in military adventures that produced no benefits. The technological and cultural knowledge that could have been gained through peaceful contact with more advanced Middle Eastern civilization was lost due to the hostile nature of the crusading encounter. Instead of learning from superior Islamic science, medicine, and philosophy, European armies focused on destruction and looting. The legacy of your participation in this historical disaster would be mutual hatred, cultural misunderstanding, and military failure rather than the religious triumph that had been promised. The Crusades damaged both civilizations and created patterns of conflict that would influence international relations for centuries. Your death in the desert would have been just another pointless tragedy in a series of pointless tragedies that stretched across 2 centuries of misguided religious warfare. The glory that was promised never existed except in the imagination of people who never experienced the brutal reality of medieval warfare in impossible conditions. The simple truth that took centuries for historians to acknowledge was that the Crusades were comprehensive failures that weakened European civilization while accomplishing none of their stated religious, political, or economic objectives. Your corpse rotting in the sand would have been physical proof that medieval holy war was nothing more than organized suicide disguised as divine mission. The romantic mythology that developed around crusading in later centuries bore no resemblance to the reality of what participants actually experienced. The knights in shining armour, the noble quests, the glorious victories existed only in literature written by people who'd never smelled a rotting crusader army or watched men die of thirst while carrying empty water skins. If you'd somehow survived the entire nightmare and lived to old age, you would have spent your final years knowing that you'd participated in one of history's most destructive and pointless military adventures. The wisdom that comes with age would have revealed that everything you'd suffered for was based on lies, propaganda, and the cynical manipulation of religious faith for political purposes. The bottom line is brutally simple. You wouldn't have lasted a day in the Crusades because the entire enterprise was designed to consume human lives for the benefit of people who stayed safely at home while you died horribly in foreign deserts for causes that didn't exist and objectives that were never achievable. Your death would have meant nothing to the nobles who sent you, nothing to the church that blessed your weapons, and nothing to the historians who would later count you as just another casualty statistic in mankind's long catalogue of organised stupidity and sanctified mass murder. The reality is that even if you somehow managed to survive the journey, the battles, the diseases, and the starvation, you'd still face the final insult that crusading had to offer: the complete and utter meaninglessness of everything you'd endured. Because here's what the recruitment speeches never mentioned. The Holy Land that you were supposedly liberating didn't want to be liberated. The Christian populations that you were meant to protect often preferred their Muslim rulers to the European invaders who claimed to represent their faith. The sacred sites you were fighting for had been functioning perfectly well under Islamic protection for centuries before your arrival. The political situation was so complex that your simple European understanding of good versus evil was not just inadequate, it was actively counterproductive. You'd find yourself fighting alongside Muslim allies against Christian enemies, then switching sides based on whoever offered better terms or seemed less likely to massacre your unit when convenient. The Crusader states that were eventually established lasted only as long as constant military reinforcement from Europe continued. The moment that support stopped, they collapsed like houses built on sand. Everything you died for would be gone within a few generations, leaving nothing but ruins and bitter memories. So there you have it. The brutal, unvarnished truth about what a crusade would have done to you. No Hollywood heroics, no noble quests, just disease, starvation, betrayal, and death in 1,000 different horrible ways. The next time someone romanticizes medieval warfare or talks about the good old days, remind them that the good old days would have killed them before breakfast. Sweet dreams, and remember, your soft bed and clean water aren't just luxuries. They're miracles that your ancestors died dreaming about.